They laughed when he inherited 50 acres of worthless mountain land. But beneath that wasteland was a hidden bunker powerful enough to destroy a billion-dollar corporation. When Ethan Walker arrived in the lonely mountains of Wyoming, most people thought he had lost everything: his family, his peace, and the life he once knew. The only soul still standing beside him was Shadow, the loyal German shepherd who had followed him through war and back. The land he inherited looked like nothing but rocks, wind, and silence. But sometimes, the most forgotten places hide the most dangerous truths. And Ethan was about to uncover one that powerful people had spent years trying to bury. Before the story continues, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? The first sound Ethan Walker heard every morning wasn't an alarm clock. It was rotor blades. Not real ones, just echoes. Ghosts from a desert thousands of miles away. He woke before sunrise in the small apartment above a closed hardware store on the edge of Casper, Wyoming, his heart already racing like he had been sprinting. His chest tightened as if the air itself had weight. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling fan spun slowly overhead. Not a helicopter, just a fan. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed through the panic the way the VA therapist had taught him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, measured, controlled. Beside the bed, a large German shepherd lifted his head from the floor. Shadow. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply stood up, walked over, and pressed his heavy head against Ethan's arm. A grounding touch. The kind that had pulled Ethan back from darker places more than once. "Yeah," Ethan muttered quietly, rubbing the dog's neck. "I'm here." Shadow's ears twitched, alert but calm. His dark eyes studied Ethan with the steady patience of a soldier who had seen the same war. Because he had. 6 years ago, they had been part of the same ranger unit in Afghanistan. Shadow had been a canine explosives detection dog. Ethan had been the handler. The two of them had walked through dust storms, bombed out villages, and narrow mountain trails where every rock could hide a roadside bomb. One afternoon outside Kandahar, Shadow had dragged Ethan backwards seconds before a buried explosive detonated under the road. 3 men in their unit never made it home that day. Ethan did. Because of the dog, now sitting quietly beside his bed. "Still watching my 6, huh?" Ethan said softly. Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside the apartment window, Wyoming was waking up slowly. The sky over the plains turned from charcoal gray to pale orange, spreading across the horizon like a slow-burning fire. Most people would call it peaceful. To Ethan, it felt empty. The war had ended for everyone else, but not for him. His marriage had collapsed within a year of coming home. His ex-wife once told him she felt like she was living with someone who was physically there, but mentally somewhere else entirely. She wasn't wrong. Jobs never lasted long either. The noise of machinery, sudden sounds, crowds, the unpredictability of coworkers coming up behind him, all of it scraped against nerves that had never fully healed. Construction work lasted 3 months. Security work lasted 2. The last job at a warehouse ended when a dropped metal pallet sent Ethan diving for cover in front of an entire shift of stunned employees. People stopped calling after that. By the time he turned 42, the world had quietly filed Ethan Walker into a category most people never think about. Forgotten. Except for Shadow. The dog had been retired from military service the same month Ethan was discharged. Officially, Shadow was considered equipment. Unofficially, he was the only thing that kept Ethan from slipping completely off the edge. They had been through too much together. Around mid-morning, Ethan was drinking burnt coffee at the small kitchen table when someone knocked on the apartment door downstairs. 3 short knocks. The landlord never knocked. Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog was already on his feet. A minute later, the landlord's voice drifted up the stairwell. "Walker! Mail for you!" Ethan walked down the creaking stairs, Shadow padding silently beside him. The landlord handed him a thick envelope. "Certified mail," he said. "Looks official." Ethan frowned at the return address. A law office in Billings, Montana. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had sent him something official that wasn't a bill. Back upstairs, he opened it slowly. Inside were several documents, legal forms, property records, and a single typed letter. Ethan read it twice before the words made sense. His grandfather had died. Thomas Walker, a man Ethan hadn't seen in almost 20 years. The letter explained that Ethan was the sole heir to a parcel of land his grandfather had owned in northern Wyoming. 50 acres. Ethan stared at the number. 50 acres. He had grown up in places where the backyard was a strip of cracked concrete behind a chain-link fence. The letter continued. The land was located in the Absaroka Range near a small mountain town called Red Pine. The property had no utilities, no structures registered with the county, and limited road access. The phrase, "undeveloped wilderness parcel," appeared several times. There was also a note. Several companies had made inquiries about purchasing the property. Ethan leaned back in the chair. 50 acres of wilderness, he murmured. Shadow tilted his head slightly. Later that week, Ethan drove to his sister's house in Cheyenne to ask if anyone else had known about the land. His sister didn't even bother hiding her amusement. "You drove all the way down here for that?" she said with a laugh. "Ethan, Grandpa's land is nothing but rocks and trees." Her husband chimed in from the couch. "Probably worth less than the truck you drove here in." "Some mining company's been sniffing around that valley for years," his sister added. "If they want it, just sell it and take the money." "How much?" Ethan asked. She shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe 10 grand? 15 if you're lucky." They talked about it like it was a joke, like it was a worthless burden someone had accidentally left in his name. Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded quietly. Later that evening, back in the apartment, he spread the maps across the kitchen table. The land sat deep in the mountains. The nearest town, Red Pine, had a population of under 600 people. The road into the valley looked like a thin thread twisting through forest and rock. Ethan stared at the map for a long time. Shadow walked over and rested his chin on the table edge. "You ever been to Wyoming mountains?" Ethan asked the dog. Shadow blinked slowly. "Yeah," Ethan said with a quiet breath. "Me neither." He folded the papers back into the envelope. Selling it made the most sense. Take the money, pay off debts, maybe start somewhere new. But something about the letter felt unfinished, like a message someone had tried to send a long time ago. Shadow nudged Ethan's arm. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "You think we should at least look at it first?" Shadow's tail tapped against the chair. Ethan glanced back down at the map. 50 acres of land everyone else thought was worthless. He didn't know it yet, but that empty patch of mountains in Wyoming was about to change everything he thought he knew about his family, and about the quiet dog sitting beside him. The next morning came cold and pale, the kind of Wyoming morning where the sky looks like frosted glass and the wind smells faintly of snow even when the ground is still dry. Ethan Walker loaded the last of his things into the old pickup truck. 2 duffel bags, a small toolbox, a dented cooler. Nothing more. He lived light these days. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, watching every movement with calm attention. His ears twitched each time a car passed on the quiet street. "All right," Ethan said, slamming the truck door shut. "Let's see what 50 acres of nothing looks like." The engine coughed twice before starting. The truck rolled onto the highway, heading northwest toward the mountains. For the first 2 hours, the landscape stayed flat and open, long stretches of prairie, fences that ran to the horizon, occasional cattle standing motionless in the wind. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on Shadow's back. The dog barely moved. Road trips had once meant deployments, cargo planes, convoys, unknown roads in foreign countries. But this drive felt different, quiet. No radio chatter, no threat reports, no sandstorms on the horizon. Just Wyoming. The roads slowly began to climb. By early afternoon, the land started to change. The plains gave way to rolling foothills. Then the foothills rose into jagged ridges covered in dark green pine. A wooden sign appeared beside the road. Red Pine, population 542. Ethan slowed the truck. The town looked like something out of another decade. A single main street. A gas station with faded paint. A small grocery store with a wooden porch. A few pickup trucks parked along the curb. The mountains rose behind the town like a wall of stone. Shadow lifted his nose and sniffed the air. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "Smells different up here." He parked outside the general store. The building looked old but solid, the kind of place that had been standing long before highways reached the valley. A small bell rang when he pushed open the door. Inside smelled like coffee, wood, and motor oil. Shelves were packed with everything from canned beans to fishing hooks. Behind the counter sat an older woman reading a newspaper. She looked up slowly over the rim of her glasses. Her hair was silver and braided down her back. Her face was weathered by mountain winters, but her eyes were sharp. "You're not from around here," she said calmly. Ethan gave a small nod. "Just passing through." Her gaze shifted briefly to Shadow. "That's a fine dog." "He's better company than most people," Ethan replied. The corner of her mouth twitched slightly. "What can I help you with?" Ethan pulled the folded property map from his jacket and placed it on the counter. "I'm looking for this parcel." The woman leaned forward and adjusted her glasses. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked up again. "Walkerland." The words came out slowly. "You related to Thomas Walker?" "He was my grandfather." Something changed in the woman's expression. Not surprise, recognition. "My name's Ruth Callahan," she said quietly. "My family's run this store for nearly 50 years. Ethan waited. Ruth tapped one finger on the map. "Your grandfather used to come through here now and then. Quiet man." "Didn't know him much," Ethan admitted. Ruth studied Ethan carefully, as if comparing him to a memory. "You got his eyes," she finally said. That caught Ethan off guard. No one had ever said that before. Ruth folded the map back toward him. "You planning to sell it?" Ethan shrugged slightly. "Maybe. Haven't even seen it yet." She nodded slowly. "Most folks do." Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ruth glanced toward the window. Beyond the glass, the mountains loomed tall and silent. "That valley your land sits in,"
she said carefully. People been sniffing around it for years. Who? A company. North Star Minerals. Ethan recognized the name. It had appeared in the legal paperwork. They want the land? They want the whole valley, Ruth said.
Been sending letters to landowners for nearly 2 decades. She leaned forward slightly. But your grandfather never sold. Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog had moved closer to the counter, watching Ruth quietly. Why not? Ethan asked. Ruth gave a slow breath. Thomas Walker wasn't the kind of man who sold things easy. Her eyes drifted again toward the mountains. Especially not that land. The silence stretched for a moment. Ethan folded the map again. How far out is it? About 20 miles up Ridgeback Road, Ruth replied. Last 5 miles are dirt. She paused. Road gets rough past the timberline. Ethan nodded. I've driven worse. Ruth looked down at Shadow again. The dog was standing perfectly still. He trained? Army canine, Ethan said. Ruth's eyebrows lifted slightly. Well, she said after a moment, if you're heading out there, better stock up. She reached behind the counter and set a few things down. Bottled water, jerky, a small first aid kit. Mountains can turn fast this time of year, she said. Ethan paid in cash. As he turned to leave, Ruth spoke again. Mr. Walker. He paused. She studied him carefully. That land of yours, she said slowly. It ain't worthless. Ethan raised an eyebrow. That's not what everyone else says. Ruth gave a faint, knowing smile. Most people only see what's on the surface. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the distant mountains again. But those mountains, she said softly, have a habit of hiding things. Outside, the wind had picked up. Clouds rolled slowly across the high peaks. Ethan climbed back into the truck. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat. For a moment, Ethan sat there looking toward the mountain road that twisted out of town and disappeared into the forest. Think the old man left us something interesting? He asked quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once against the seat. Ethan turned the key. The truck rumbled to life. As they pulled out of Red Pine and onto the narrow road leading into the Absaroka Range, Ethan had no idea that within a few hours he would be standing on land everyone believed was worthless, and that the dog beside him was about to find something buried beneath it. The road leaving Red Pine narrowed quickly. Within minutes, the pavement disappeared behind Ethan's truck, replaced by a ribbon of packed dirt that twisted into the mountains like a snake disappearing into tall grass. Pine trees closed in on both sides of the road, their dark trunks rising straight into the cold afternoon sky. The deeper they drove, the quieter the world became. No houses, no power lines, just mountains. Ethan rolled the window down halfway. The air smelled sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, its voice echoing across the valley. Shadow leaned slightly toward the open window, nose working steadily as he sampled the new environment. You like it already, huh? Ethan said. The dog's ears flicked forward. They climbed steadily for nearly an hour. The road grew rougher, forcing Ethan to slow down. Rocks rattled under the tires. The truck bounced over shallow ruts carved by years of rain and snowmelt. The mountains around them rose higher now, their gray granite faces streaked with dark shadows where snow still clung in narrow crevices. Ethan followed the map Ruth had pointed out earlier. Ridgeback Road. The sign marking the turn was barely visible, half swallowed by brush. He pulled onto the smaller trail, and the truck crawled forward slowly. 5 more miles. At the 3-mile mark, Ethan stopped the truck and stepped out for a moment. The silence hit him immediately. Not the soft quiet of a town. This was a deep wilderness silence, broken only by wind whispering through branches. It felt ancient. Shadow jumped out beside him, stretching his legs before trotting a slow circle around the truck. Ethan leaned against the hood and studied the surrounding terrain. Steep slopes, clusters of dark pine, jagged rock formations poking through the forest floor. "This land better have something special on it," he muttered. Shadow sniffed along the roadside, tail moving slowly. Then the dog froze. His body stiffened. Ethan noticed immediately. Shadow rarely reacted like that without reason. "What is it?" The dog lifted his head, scanning the woods. After a few seconds, he relaxed and returned to Ethan's side. False alarm. Ethan exhaled slowly. PTSD had taught him something useful. When the world suddenly went quiet, pay attention. But nothing else moved in the trees. No sound of vehicles, no distant voices. Just wind. They climbed back into the truck and continued the last stretch. The road ended without warning. One moment there was a narrow trail cutting through the trees. The next, it simply opened into a clearing where the land dropped away toward a wide valley below. Ethan shut off the engine. The sudden stillness was almost startling. "Guess this is it." He stepped out of the truck. The clearing stretched across several acres before the terrain sloped downward into rough stone ridges and patches of tall grass. This was the Walker land. 50 acres of what looked like nothing but mountain rock and scattered forest. Ethan walked a few steps into the clearing. The wind pushed gently through the trees, carrying the sound of rustling branches. In the distance, the Absaroka peaks rose like silent giants. For a moment, Ethan just stood there. This place was bigger than he had imagined, and emptier. He pulled the property map from his jacket and compared it to the terrain around him. According to the survey lines, the land stretched across the ridge and down toward the valley floor. But there was almost nothing here, except... Ethan turned slowly. Near the far edge of the clearing sat a small structure partially hidden by trees. A cabin. The building leaned slightly to one side, as if the mountain itself had grown tired of holding it up. Weathered boards covered the walls. The roof sagged under years of snow and rain. One window was broken. Another had been boarded shut. Ethan walked toward it slowly. Shadow moved ahead of him, ears forward. The closer they got, the more the cabin looked abandoned. The porch steps had collapsed on one side. Pine needles had gathered along the edges like dust. Ethan stepped onto the porch carefully. The boards creaked under his weight. "Looks like Grandpa didn't exactly leave us a mansion," he said quietly. Shadow sniffed along the doorframe. Ethan pushed the door open. The hinges groaned loudly in the still air. Inside, the cabin was dark but intact. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, shining through cracks in the wood. The room held only a few pieces of furniture. A small table, a rusted stove, an old chair missing one leg. Ethan walked slowly across the creaking floorboards. Every step echoed through the empty structure. "Not much here," he murmured. Shadow wandered across the room, sniffing along the walls. The dog paused near the far corner. Then he began circling the room slowly, nose low, focused. Ethan noticed the shift immediately. Shadow's behavior had changed. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was working. The same careful pattern he used when searching for explosives. Ethan's instincts sharpened. "What did you find, boy?" Shadow moved toward the center of the cabin. Then he stopped. One paw lifted slightly. The dog sniffed the floor. Once, twice. Then he scratched the wood, hard. Ethan frowned. "It's just a floor." Shadow scratched again, more aggressively this time. The claws made a sharp scraping sound across the old boards. Ethan walked over. "Easy, Shadow." The dog didn't stop. He scratched again, then stepped back and barked once. A short, sharp sound. The same alert bark he used during searches overseas. Ethan crouched down slowly. All right. He brushed aside a layer of dust. The floorboard Shadow had been scratching looked slightly different than the others. Not by much, but enough. A faint gap ran along one edge. Ethan ran his fingers along the seam. Loose. Very loose. His heartbeat picked up. He found a small notch along the board's edge and pulled. The wood resisted at first. Then it lifted. A hidden compartment. Ethan stared down into the dark space beneath the floor. Inside rested a bundle wrapped in old cloth. Shadow leaned forward, watching closely. Ethan reached inside and carefully lifted the bundle out. The cloth fell away. Inside were two things: a weathered leather notebook and a set of rolled blueprints tied with faded string. Ethan sat back slowly. "What were you hiding up here, Grandpa?" Outside, the wind swept across the mountain ridge. Inside the old cabin, Ethan carefully untied the string around the blueprints. The paper crackled softly as it opened. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Lines, measurements, structural diagrams. Then his eyes found the title block printed along the edge of the page. Subsurface structure, Walker property. Ethan's breath caught. These aren't cabin plans. Shadow shifted beside him, watching Ethan carefully. Ethan studied the blueprint again. The drawings showed something massive. Rooms, corridors, steel reinforcement walls, ventilation systems, and the entire structure was located deep beneath the mountain, directly below where Ethan now sat. He looked slowly around the silent cabin. Dusty walls, broken windows, rotting floorboards. The place looked abandoned for decades, but according to the blueprint, this cabin was only the entrance. Ethan swallowed slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we just found something." Shadow's ears perked, because somewhere beneath the quiet mountain, something very large had been built, and Ethan Walker had just discovered the first clue. For several long seconds, Ethan didn't move. The blueprint rested open across his knees, the thin paper trembling slightly in the draft coming through the cracked cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing through the pines like distant surf rolling across a dark shore. Shadow sat beside him, alert and silent. Ethan ran a hand across his beard slowly, eyes scanning the page again. Corridors, reinforced concrete, storage chambers, ventilation shafts. The structure wasn't small. It was enormous. Whoever designed this hadn't planned a storm shelter or a root cellar. This was something far more serious, something meant to last a very long time. Ethan looked up at the cabin again. Rotting beams, broken window glass, dust thick enough to write in. Nothing about the building suggested something this complex lay hidden beneath it. He picked up the leather notebook and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with tight, deliberate handwriting. His grandfather's. Most entries were short. Dates, measurements, notes about concrete deliveries, steel supports, ventilation placement. But a few entries stood out. One read, "Surface structure must remain unimpressive. The less attention, the better." Another entry, "Entrance point concealed beneath stone cluster north of cabin. Access requires manual lever." Ethan read that line again. North of cabin. Shadow stood suddenly, his ears lifted toward the doorway. Ethan looked up. "What is it?" The dog walked toward the door slowly, nose low to the ground. His posture had changed again. Focused. Intent. Ethan recognized that stance instantly. Search mode. Shadow stepped out onto the porch and paused. Then he turned his head toward the trees beyond the clearing. Ethan followed. The mountain air was colder now. The afternoon sun had shifted behind tall ridges, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The land north of the cabin sloped slightly upward, covered with scattered boulders and thick patches of brush. Ethan stepped down from the porch. "You smelling something?" Shadow began walking. Not running. Walking with steady purpose. Ethan grabbed the notebook and blueprint and followed. The dog moved about 30 yards into the trees before stopping beside a cluster of large granite rocks, half buried in moss and soil. Shadow sniffed along the ground. Then he began digging. Fast. Dirt sprayed backward as his paws tore into the loose earth. "Easy," Ethan said. But the dog ignored him. Shadow dug harder, muscles working under his thick coat. Within seconds, a shallow hole had formed. Ethan knelt beside him. "What are you seeing?" Shadow stopped suddenly. He leaned forward and sniffed the exposed ground. Then he barked once. A short, sharp alert. Ethan brushed the loose dirt aside with his hands. At first, he saw only rock and compacted soil. Then his fingers struck metal. Cold. Smooth. He cleared more dirt. A curved surface appeared beneath the earth. Steel. Ethan's pulse jumped. He wiped the dirt away carefully until the shape became clear. A circular steel hatch, nearly 4 feet across. The metal surface had been camouflaged with dirt and moss so perfectly it blended with the surrounding stone. If Shadow hadn't smelled it, Ethan would have walked past without noticing. He leaned back on his heels. "Well, I'll be damned." Shadow sat beside the hole, tail sweeping slowly through the dirt. Ethan brushed more soil away until he found the edge of a recessed handle. The steel was old but intact. He tugged gently. Nothing. The hatch didn't move. Ethan stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what Grandpa buried." He returned to the cabin and searched the small tool crate he had brought with him. Inside were basic tools: hammer, wrench, a short pry bar. He carried the pry bar back to the rocks. Shadow followed closely. Ethan wedged the bar under the steel handle and pulled. The hatch didn't budge. "Come on," he grunted. He shifted the bar for better leverage and leaned his full weight onto it. The metal groaned faintly. A seal broke somewhere beneath the surface with a deep, hollow sound. Then slowly, the hatch lifted. Cold air rushed out of the opening like breath from the mountain itself. Old air, stale, untouched. Ethan stepped back instinctively. Shadow stood beside the opening, ears forward, staring down into the darkness. Ethan walked closer. Inside the circular opening was a ladder, steel rungs bolted into a concrete shaft. The darkness below swallowed the fading daylight completely. "How deep does that go?" Ethan whispered. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness but faded after 20 feet. The shaft continued far below. Shadow whined softly. Not fear, concern. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. "I know." The mountain wind moved softly through the trees behind them. For a moment, Ethan considered closing the hatch again, selling the land, driving back to town, pretending none of this existed. But the blueprint, the notebook, the secret construction logs, none of it had been built by accident. His grandfather had spent years hiding this place. And now, Ethan was standing on the threshold of it. He looked down at Shadow. "You came through caves in Afghanistan with me," he said quietly. "You think we can handle Wyoming?" Shadow's tail thumped once. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, thought so." He tied a rope from the truck bed around a nearby tree trunk as a precaution. Then he clipped a flashlight to his belt. The hatch creaked softly as he pulled it open wider. Cold air continued drifting upward from the shaft. Ethan swung one leg over the edge. His boot found the first rung of the ladder. He hesitated. Then he looked down into the darkness. "All right," he murmured. "Let's see what you built, Grandpa." And with Shadow watching from above, Ethan Walker began climbing down into the hidden structure beneath the mountain. The steel ladder was cold under his hands. Each rung echoed faintly as his boots descended deeper into the shaft. The sound of the wind above quickly faded until there was nothing left but the quiet creak of metal and the slow rhythm of Ethan's breathing. The flashlight clipped to his belt cut a narrow beam through the darkness. Concrete walls surrounded him, smooth, perfectly poured. Not the rough stone of a natural cave. This had been engineered. "Grandpa?" Ethan muttered quietly. The ladder continued downward farther than he expected. 20 feet. 30. Maybe more. The air grew cooler as he descended, carrying the dry, stale smell of a place sealed for years. At last, his boot touched solid ground. Ethan stepped off the ladder slowly. The flashlight beam swung across the room. He stood inside a circular chamber roughly 15 feet wide. The walls were reinforced concrete, thick and smooth, with metal brackets set into the surface at regular intervals. A large steel door stood opposite the ladder. It looked like something taken from an old bank vault. Ethan stepped closer. The door had a wheel handle in the center and a heavy locking mechanism built into the frame. A thin layer of dust coated everything, but the metal showed almost no rust. Whoever built this had done it right. "Shadow!" Ethan called upward. A moment later, the dog's face appeared in the circular opening above. Shadow watched carefully, ears forward. "You staying up there?" The dog gave a low whine. Ethan chuckled softly. "Smart." He turned back toward the door. The wheel resisted at first, but after a firm push it began to move. Metal bolts inside the door slid back with a deep mechanical sound that echoed through the chamber. Ethan pulled. The door swung open slowly. The beam of his flashlight spilled into a wide hallway. Ethan stepped through and stopped. The space beyond was far larger than he imagined. The hallway stretched nearly 30 feet before opening into a broad underground room. Lights lined the ceiling, old industrial fixtures. Ethan flipped a nearby switch out of instinct. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a quiet hum, the lights flickered once, twice, and turned on. Warm yellow light filled the chamber. Ethan blinked. He was standing inside an underground living space, a large one. The room looked like the interior of a modest home. There was a sofa against one wall, covered with a protective sheet. A wooden table sat near a small kitchenette built along the far side. Shelves lined another wall. Books, dozens of them. A wood-burning stove stood near the center of the room, with a pipe running up through the ceiling toward the ventilation system. The air felt dry, clean, as if the place had been sealed carefully against the outside world. Ethan walked forward slowly. His boots echoed softly on the concrete floor. "This isn't a bunker," he whispered. "This is a house." He brushed dust from the table surface with his sleeve. The furniture was old but well maintained. Someone had built this place to live in, not just to hide. A hallway extended deeper into the structure. Ethan followed it. The first door opened into a bedroom. The bed was neatly made. A dresser stood against the wall. A lamp rested on a small bedside table. It looked like someone had simply stepped out of the room and never returned. Ethan's flashlight beam landed on something sitting on the desk near the windowless wall. A photograph. He picked it up. The glass frame was dusty but intact. The picture showed a small family standing outside the very same cabin above them. A younger version of his grandfather stood beside a woman Ethan didn't recognize. Between them stood a man in his early 30s holding a small child. Ethan stared at the man's face. Strong jaw, dark hair, eyes that looked painfully familiar. "My dad," Ethan whispered. He had seen only a few photographs of his father growing up. Most had been lost after his parents died when Ethan was young. Seeing the picture now felt like opening a door to a part of his life that had been buried long ago. Shadow barked once above. The sound echoed faintly down the shaft. Ethan set the photograph down carefully. "I'm all right," he called. He continued exploring. Another room held storage shelves stacked with sealed food containers. Large water tanks lined the walls beside a filtration system connected to thick pipes running through the concrete. A survival system. Years' worth of supplies. The final room at the end of the hallway was different. The door was heavier. Inside stood several metal filing cabinets and an old desk. Papers were stacked neatly across its surface. On the wall hung a large map of the surrounding valley. Red markings covered several locations. Ethan approached slowly. Something about the room felt important, personal. The desk drawer slid open easily. Inside lay a sealed envelope. His name was written across the front. Ethan Walker. The handwriting matched the notebook he had found earlier. His grandfather's. Ethan sat slowly in the desk chair. For a long moment he simply stared at the envelope. Outside, the mountain wind whispered far above through the trees. Down here, the bunker was perfectly silent. Finally, Ethan opened the letter. Inside were several pages of neatly written text. The first line made his chest tighten. "My grandson Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you have finally found what I built beneath the mountain." Ethan leaned back slowly. Whatever this place was, it had never been meant to stay hidden forever. And somewhere inside the letter now resting in his hands was the truth about why his grandfather had built it. Ethan sat in the metal chair beneath the quiet hum of the bunker lights, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. For a moment, he didn't read. He simply stared at the handwriting. The same tight script he remembered from the birthday cards his grandfather used to send when Ethan was a kid, back when life had still felt simple. Shadow barked again above the ladder shaft, the sound echoing faintly down the concrete tunnel. Ethan glanced toward the hallway. "I'm all right," he called upward. Then he looked back at the letter. Slowly, he began reading. "My grandson Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you found the entrance your dog helped uncover. I always suspected it would be a dog that led you here. A good dog sees what men miss. There are things about this mountain your father tried to expose, things powerful men worked very hard to bury. I built this place to protect that truth until someone strong enough could carry it forward." Ethan's jaw tightened. His father. The name alone stirred memories that had always felt incomplete. A man who had died when Ethan was young, in what everyone called a highway accident. But the letter continued. "Your father was not only a good man, he was a brave one. Too brave for the people he challenged. Before his death, he discovered that a mining company called North Star Minerals had been dumping chemical waste deep in the valleys west of this mountain. Toxic waste that slowly poisoned the water feeding the towns in this region. He planned to expose them." Ethan stopped reading. The room suddenly felt colder. North Star Minerals. The same company Ruth had mentioned in the store. The same company trying to buy this land. He looked around the bunker again. The filing cabinets, the maps, the shelves of documents. All of it suddenly made sense. He turned the page. "After your father died, I knew the truth had to be protected. I gathered every piece of evidence he had collected. I hid it here, beneath the land they have tried for years to buy. This bunker was never meant to be a refuge from the world. It was meant to be a vault, a place where the truth could survive long enough for someone to use it." Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. His heart was beating harder now. He thought about the drone Shadow had sensed earlier, the land offers, the sudden interest in a forgotten patch of mountain. North Star hadn't wanted the land for mining. They wanted what was buried beneath it. Or maybe what was hidden inside it. Footsteps echoed above. Shadow. The dog's nails scraped against the metal edge of the hatch. Ethan stood and walked back toward the ladder shaft. "You coming down?" Shadow peered into the darkness for a moment. Then, cautiously, the German shepherd placed one paw on the ladder. Ethan stepped back as the dog began climbing carefully down the rungs, muscle and instinct guiding him. When Shadow reached the floor, he shook himself once and looked around the chamber. His ears twitched. His nose lifted. He began walking slowly through the bunker hallway, investigating, just like he had done 100 times during patrols overseas. Ethan followed. The dog entered the large living chamber and paused beside the bookshelves. Then he moved toward the storage room. His nose drifted along the metal cabinets. Finally, Shadow stopped beside the final room, the office, the one with the filing cabinets. He sat down beside the desk. Ethan returned to the chair and looked again at the letter. The final page was shorter. "If you have reached this point, it means you have already survived things in life that made you stronger than most men. You may be tempted to walk away from this fight. I would understand. But if you choose to stay, everything you need to expose them is here." Ethan folded the letter slowly. Then he looked at the filing cabinets. There were 5 of them, each one labeled carefully. Environmental tests, chemical reports, witness statements, corporate records, video archive. His grandfather hadn't just hidden the truth, he had documented it completely. Ethan opened the first cabinet. Inside were rows of thick folders. He pulled one out. Water sample reports, toxicity levels, independent lab confirmations. He opened another cabinet. Inside were printed emails between North Star executives discussing containment issues and legal exposure. Shadow let out a low growl. Ethan turned. The dog stood near the hallway, staring toward the ladder shaft, listening. Ethan froze. At first, he heard nothing. Then, very faintly, the distant buzz of something mechanical outside. A low electronic hum. Ethan walked to the ladder and climbed halfway up the shaft. When he reached the top, he carefully pushed the hatch open just enough to look outside. The sky had darkened. Night had fallen across the mountains. But high above the tree line, a small, blinking light drifted silently across the clearing. A drone. Hovering. Watching. Ethan slowly closed the hatch again. When he reached the bottom, Shadow was waiting. The dog's eyes were sharp, focused. Ethan exhaled slowly. "They know," he said quietly. Shadow sat beside him. The bunker lights hummed softly overhead. For the first time since finding the hidden structure, Ethan understood something important. The bunker wasn't just a discovery. It was the beginning of a war someone else had started years ago. And now, that war had just found him. For a long moment, Ethan stood in the quiet bunker, listening to the faint hum of electricity and the slow rhythm of Shadow's breathing beside him. The drone outside might have drifted away, or it might still be hovering above the trees, watching, waiting. Ethan walked back into the office and placed the letter carefully on the desk. His grandfather had known this day might come. Everything in this bunker had been built with patience, purpose, precision. A soldier would recognize that kind of preparation anywhere. Shadow padded quietly across the concrete floor and lay down near the doorway, facing the hallway like a sentry. Even injured veterans, Ethan thought, never really stop being soldiers. He opened another drawer in the desk. Inside was a small cassette recorder. Old, heavy, the kind people used before everything went digital. Beside it lay a single cassette tape in a plastic case. A handwritten label covered the front. For Ethan. Ethan picked it up slowly, his grandfather's handwriting again. He glanced toward Shadow. "You hear that drone?" Shadow lifted his head slightly, ears twitching. But the dog didn't growl this time. Maybe the machine had moved on. Or maybe the mountain wind had carried the sound away. Ethan slid the cassette into the recorder and pressed the play button. The machine clicked. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice came through the speaker. Old, tired, but steady. His grandfather. "Ethan, if you're listening to this, it means you found the bunker and you read the letter." The voice paused briefly, as if the man recording it had taken a slow breath. "I'm sorry you had to discover the truth this way. Some things a grandfather should be able to tell his grandson face to face." Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. The voice continued. "Your father didn't die in a car accident." The words hung in the room like smoke. Ethan's fingers tightened around the armrest. "He died because he was about to expose North Star Minerals for poisoning the water in this valley. Your father gathered evidence for 2 years. Water samples, internal documents, statements from engineers inside the company. The recording crackled softly. They found out he had the proof. Ethan's jaw tightened. The voice lowered. 2 weeks before he planned to release everything, his truck went off the highway near Cody Canyon. The police called it an accident caused by icy roads. A long silence filled the tape. But I knew better. Ethan closed his eyes. He had grown up hearing the story of the accident 100 times. A rainy night, a dangerous curve, a tragic mistake. But now the pieces of his grandfather's bunker made terrible sense. I spent years collecting the rest of the evidence your father left behind, the recording continued. I built this bunker so it couldn't disappear. Shadow shifted slightly beside the doorway. The dog's eyes were open again, watching, listening. The recording moved forward. There is more than enough proof in those cabinets to bring North Star down if the right people see it. The voice paused. But powerful companies don't give up easily. Another long breath. If you choose to walk away from this, Ethan, I will not blame you. A man who has already fought in war deserves peace. Ethan stared at the desk. Peace. That word felt almost foreign now. But if you choose to fight, the voice said quietly, you won't be alone. There is a lawyer in Jackson Hole named Daniel Harper. He's one of the few men I trusted with part of this story. Ethan straightened slightly. His contact information is in the second drawer of the filing cabinet marked Legal. The recorder crackled again. And one more thing. The voice softened. I always believed you would come here with that dog of yours. Ethan blinked. How did you know? He murmured under his breath. The recording answered as if the old man were sitting in the room. I met Shadow once, remember? When you brought him home after your first deployment. Ethan smiled faintly. He remembered that visit now. Shadow had been younger then, still lean from training, still carrying the focus of a military canine. He watched the room like a guardian, the recording continued. Dogs like that don't forget their job. The tape ended with one final sentence. Trust the dog, Ethan. He will see danger before you do. The recorder clicked softly as the tape reached its end. Silence returned to the bunker. Ethan sat motionless for a long moment. Then he stood. Shadow rose immediately. The dog walked to Ethan and pressed his shoulder lightly against the man's leg. Ethan rested his hand on the thick fur along Shadow's neck. Looks like Grandpa knew you pretty well, he said quietly. Shadow wagged his tail once. But suddenly the dog froze. His ears snapped upright. A low growl rolled from his chest. Ethan looked toward the hallway. What is it? Shadow moved quickly toward the ladder shaft. Ethan followed. The dog's nose lifted toward the sealed hatch above. The growl deepened. Something had changed. Ethan climbed halfway up the ladder again and pressed his ear against the metal hatch. At first he heard nothing. Then, footsteps. Very faint, crunching through gravel and pine needles outside. More than one person. Ethan's heart slowed. Not fear. Focus. The kind of focus he hadn't felt since leaving the army. Shadow looked up at him from below. Ethan whispered softly, "They're here." And above them, somewhere in the dark forest around the cabin, someone had come looking for the bunker. Ethan stayed perfectly still on the ladder, his ear pressed lightly against the cold steel hatch. Outside, the faint crunch of boots moved slowly across the ground above the rocks. Not animals. People. Two of them,
maybe 3.
The mountain night carried sounds strangely, but Ethan could hear enough to know they were searching. Shadow stood at the bottom of the ladder shaft, body rigid, head tilted upward. Another low growl rolled through the dog's chest. Ethan climbed quietly down the ladder. His voice was barely a whisper. "Easy." Shadow stopped growling, but remained alert, eyes fixed on the hatch. Ethan stepped into the bunker chamber again and moved quickly but carefully toward the office. The lights suddenly felt too bright, too obvious. He flipped 2 switches near the hallway. Half the bunker lights shut off instantly, leaving the space dim but still usable. Military habit. Reduce visibility. Shadow followed close beside him. Ethan opened the cabinet labeled "Legal" and searched through the folders until he found a small envelope with a business card inside. Daniel Harper, Environmental Law, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The same name from the recording. Ethan slipped the card into his jacket pocket. Then he turned toward the filing cabinets again. The evidence his grandfather had collected filled dozens of folders. Water contamination reports, chemical analysis, photographs, recorded statements from former North Star engineers. Years of work. Proof strong enough to ruin a billion-dollar company, if it ever reached the right courtroom. Shadow's ears twitched again. The footsteps above had stopped. Now there were voices, muffled, too distant to understand clearly. Ethan moved silently back toward the ladder. He climbed halfway again and listened. One voice spoke quietly above the rocks. "Nothing here." Another answered. "Drone flagged the heat signature earlier." Ethan's chest tightened. Heat signature. They were using thermal imaging, looking for people, looking for movement beneath the trees. The first voice again. "Cabin's empty." A pause. "Boss said check the whole property." The sound of footsteps moved again, this time farther away, toward the cabin. Ethan exhaled slowly. Shadow watched him from below. Ethan climbed down again. "They're searching the land," he whispered. Shadow's tail remained stiff behind him. The dog understood the tone. Danger. Ethan looked around the bunker again. The place his grandfather built had hidden the truth for decades. But it wouldn't stay hidden much longer. If North Star suspected the bunker existed, they would come back. With more people, more equipment, and less patience. Ethan walked into the office and opened another cabinet labeled Witness Statements. Inside were several audio recordings and printed interviews. He pulled one folder out. The name on the front read, Samuel Ortega, North Star drilling engineer. Ethan flipped through the pages. The testimony described underground waste dumping operations hidden beneath abandoned mining sites. Barrels buried beneath rock layers. Chemicals leaking slowly into groundwater. Entire creeks contaminated. Small towns downstream developing unexplained illnesses over the years. Ethan's hands tightened around the folder. The valley above him suddenly felt different. Not just beautiful, but wounded. Poisoned quietly over time. Shadow padded back toward the ladder and sat beneath it, listening again. Ethan closed the folder and returned it to the cabinet. If he stayed here too long, they might discover the hatch. But leaving the bunker meant stepping back into the open. And those men were still somewhere in the forest. Ethan turned off the remaining lights. Darkness swallowed most of the underground rooms. Only a small lamp near the ladder remained. Shadow stood beside him. The dog's breathing was calm again, but his posture remained tense. Ethan crouched and scratched behind Shadow's ear. Just like old patrols, huh? Shadow blinked slowly. The dog had walked through worse places than this. War zones, mountain passes, villages that could turn dangerous in seconds. But this time, the threat wasn't across an ocean. It was here, in his own country. Ethan climbed the ladder slowly. Halfway up, he paused again and listened. The voices above were gone. Only the wind remained, whispering through the trees. He pushed the hatch open a few inches. Cold night air slipped down into the shaft. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan climbed out slowly. Shadow followed seconds later, pulling himself over the edge with practiced strength. The two of them crouched beside the rocks. Moonlight filtered through the tall pines. The cabin stood dark in the clearing. But near the edge of the trees, Ethan spotted tire tracks. Fresh. 2 vehicles had driven across the clearing earlier that evening. They had parked near the cabin, and now they were gone. Shadow sniffed the ground near the tracks. Then he looked up at Ethan. The dog gave a single soft bark. Ethan nodded slowly. They'll be back. He covered the hatch again carefully, brushing dirt and moss over the steel until it blended once more with the stones. Then he stood and looked toward the cabin. The quiet mountain valley stretched in every direction beneath the cold Wyoming sky. Somewhere out there, a corporation powerful enough to poison entire towns had just realized the truth they buried might still exist. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's back. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we call the lawyer. Shadow wagged his tail once, but neither of them knew yet that North Star Minerals was already planning its next move. Morning came slowly to the Absaroka Range. Cold light slid over the mountain peaks and filtered down through the pine forest surrounding Ethan Walker's cabin. The valley was quiet again, as if the strange footsteps from the night before had never happened. But Ethan knew better. He stood on the cabin porch with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, while Shadow sat beside him, watching the tree line. The German shepherd had barely slept. Neither had Ethan. Old instincts had returned during the night. The same alertness he once carried during patrols overseas. Every sound meant something. Every shadow might hide danger. Now the mountains looked peaceful again. Too peaceful. Ethan sipped the coffee slowly. You think they're watching from somewhere? Shadow's ears twitched, but the dog stayed silent. Ethan looked down at the business card in his other hand. Daniel Harper, environmental attorney, Jackson Hole. If his grandfather was right, Harper might be the only person who could turn the bunker's evidence into something powerful enough to stop North Star. Ethan pulled out his phone. The signal was weak in the mountains, but it held just enough bars to make a call. The line rang 3 times. Then a calm voice answered. Daniel Harper? Ethan hesitated for only a second. My name is Ethan Walker. A short pause came through the speaker. And how can I help you, Mr. Walker? Ethan stared out at the valley while he spoke. My grandfather was Thomas Walker. The reaction on the other end was immediate. Silence. Then a slow exhale. I wondered when someone from that family would call me. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. You knew him? I did, Harper replied quietly. Your grandfather came to me nearly 15 years ago with concerns about North Star Minerals. Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the forest. He built something beneath my land, Ethan said. Another pause. A bunker. The lawyer spoke carefully now. And you found it? Yes. And the documents inside? They're real. The line went quiet again. Finally, Harper spoke. Mr. Walker, if what your grandfather gathered is still intact, you may be holding the most important environmental evidence in this region. Ethan looked toward the mountains. That's what he thought too. Harper's voice lowered slightly. Listen carefully. If North Star suspects those files exist, they will try to get them before anyone else sees them. They already tried, Ethan said, last night. That earned another silence. Then Harper said calmly, You need to get copies of everything, digital copies, as soon as possible. I can do that. Good. And Mr. Walker, yes? Do not trust anyone connected to North Star. They have lawyers, investigators, and private security teams. They play hard when billions of dollars are involved. Ethan nodded slowly, even though Harper couldn't see him. Understood. I'll drive to Red Pine tomorrow, Harper continued. We'll meet somewhere public and talk about the next step. Ethan felt something inside his chest shift slightly. Hope. Thank you. The call ended. Ethan slipped the phone into his pocket. Shadow stood suddenly. The dog's body stiffened as he stared down the dirt road leading to the cabin. Ethan followed his gaze. A black SUV rolled slowly into the clearing. The vehicle moved quietly across the dirt road and stopped about 20 yards from the porch. Ethan set the coffee cup down. Shadow stepped forward beside him. The driver's door opened. A man in an expensive dark suit stepped out. He looked completely out of place in the rugged mountain clearing. Polished shoes, perfect haircut, calm smile. The man walked toward the porch with the relaxed confidence of someone used to controlling situations. Mr. Walker, he called pleasantly. Ethan didn't move. Shadow stood silent at his side. The man stopped at the bottom step. Victor Lang, he said, extending a hand that Ethan ignored. Legal counsel for North Star Minerals. Ethan folded his arms. What do you want? Lang smiled politely. I came to discuss your property. Ethan said nothing. Lang glanced briefly at the surrounding land. 50 acres in this part of Wyoming. Beautiful country. Say what you came to say, Ethan replied. Lang reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder. Inside was a contract. We're prepared to purchase your land immediately. North Star would like to offer you $2 million. Ethan almost laughed. $2 million for land everyone in his family had called worthless. The bunker's secret suddenly felt very real. I'm not selling, Ethan said calmly. Lang's smile didn't fade. Perhaps you should think about it carefully. I already have. The lawyer studied Ethan for a moment. Then his voice softened slightly. You know, Mr. Walker, the mountains can be dangerous. Shadow growled quietly. Lang glanced at the dog. Roads get icy. Trucks lose control. Accidents happen. The smile finally returned to his face. But North Star prefers peaceful solutions. Ethan stepped forward on the porch. Here's my peaceful solution. Lang raised an eyebrow. Drive away. The lawyer stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Very well. He turned and walked back toward the SUV. But before getting inside, Lang paused. One more thing, Mr. Walker. Ethan didn't answer. Lang spoke without turning around. If you reconsider our offer, call me before things become complicated. The SUV door closed. The engine started. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road. Silence returned to the clearing. Shadow continued staring toward the trees long after the car was gone. Ethan exhaled slowly. "They're scared." Shadow looked up at him. "And that means Grandpa's evidence is real." Ethan turned toward the cabin. But just as he stepped inside, a sharp bark exploded from Shadow. Ethan spun around. The dog was limping. Blood stained the fur on his front leg. Ethan dropped to his knees instantly. "Shadow!" The dog had stepped on something hidden in the dirt near the porch. A thin metal spike, almost invisible, stuck from the ground. A trap. Ethan's chest burned with sudden anger. The SUV had barely reached the road before someone planted it. He pulled the spike free and pressed his hand against the wound. Shadow whined softly, but stayed still. Ethan looked toward the empty road. Victor Lang had come smiling, but the message he left behind was very clear. The war had just begun. Ethan knelt beside Shadow in the dirt outside the cabin, his hands steady despite the anger rising inside his chest. The German shepherd's leg was bleeding, but not badly. The spike had cut through the thick fur and skin, leaving a narrow wound just above the paw. "Easy, buddy," Ethan murmured. Shadow watched him calmly, ears slightly back, but eyes alert. The dog trusted him completely. Ethan carefully wrapped the leg with a strip torn from an old shirt and secured it with gauze from the small first aid kit he kept in the truck. Shadow gave a soft huff through his nose. "You've had worse in Afghanistan," Ethan said quietly. The memory flashed in his mind. Dust, gunfire, Shadow dragging him behind a broken wall while bullets struck the concrete around them. The dog had saved his life once already. Now someone had tried to hurt him to send a message. Ethan finished tying the bandage and sat back slowly. The quiet mountains around the cabin suddenly felt different. Less like home, more like a battlefield. Shadow stood carefully on the injured leg. He tested it once, then twice. The limp was small but noticeable. Ethan ran a hand down the dog's neck. "We're not done here," he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail once. Inside the cabin, Ethan cleared a space on the wooden table and set up his laptop. The bunker below held the evidence. But evidence meant nothing if it stayed hidden underground. He needed copies. Thousands of pages of documents waited inside the filing cabinets. Video recordings, lab reports, corporate emails. Proof that could destroy North Star Minerals. Ethan descended into the bunker again, with Shadow moving carefully behind him. The underground lights flickered on one by one. The bunker felt different now. Not just mysterious, important. The place his grandfather built had become a command center. Ethan opened the cabinet labeled Environmental Tests. He carried armfuls of folders to the desk and began scanning them into his laptop using a portable scanner he kept in his truck. Page after page appeared on the screen. Chemical reports, water contamination charts, independent lab confirmations. Shadow lay near the office doorway, resting his injured leg but keeping his head raised toward the hallway. Guarding. Always guarding. Hours passed. The mountain sunlight faded above them as evening settled across the valley. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes. "Almost there," he muttered. The final set of files came from the video archive cabinet. Inside were several memory drives and older digital recordings transferred from tapes. Ethan plugged one of the drives into the laptop. A video file opened. The screen flickered.
A man appeared sitting at a table. Gray hair, oil-stained work jacket. He looked nervous. A label appeared beneath the video. Samuel Ortega, former North Star drilling engineer. The man spoke slowly. I worked for North Star 15 years. What they told the public about waste storage is a lie. Ethan leaned closer to the screen. Behind Ortega in the video was a map of the valley. Red circles marked several locations. The same ones Ethan had seen on the bunker wall. Barrels of chemical waste were buried under the old mine tunnels west of Red Pine, Ortega continued. They said the rock layers would seal it off, but the chemicals leaked into groundwater. He paused and rubbed his forehead. The company knew. They just didn't care. The video ended. Ethan sat back slowly. Shadow lifted his head. Ethan looked at the dog. That's it, he said quietly. That's the smoking gun. He uploaded the files to a secure cloud server. Then he sent a single encrypted message to Daniel Harper.
The message contained one sentence. You need to see this. The upload bar on the screen slowly reached 100%. Ethan closed the laptop. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, he felt something close to certainty. North Star couldn't erase the evidence anymore, not unless they erased him. Shadow rose carefully and walked beside him. The two of them climbed back up through the hatch into the cold mountain night. Stars filled the sky above the Absaroka Range. The valley was silent again. But Ethan knew that silence would not last long. Down the dirt road far below the ridge, headlights moved slowly along the highway. A convoy of dark vehicles, driving toward Red Pine. North Star was gathering its people. Ethan looked at Shadow. We're not running. The dog's ears lifted. We're finishing what Grandpa started. The wind moved through the tall pines, and somewhere beyond the mountains, the legal battle that could expose one of the largest environmental crimes in the region was beginning to take shape. Morning arrived with pale gold sunlight spilling across the Absaroka peaks. Frost clung to the tall grass around Ethan Walker's cabin, and the wind carried the clean scent of pine down from the ridges. Ethan stood outside the cabin door with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Shadow sat beside him. The dog's injured leg was wrapped carefully in fresh bandages. The limp was still there, but the determination in his dark eyes hadn't faded. Ethan scratched behind Shadow's ear. You're tougher than half the soldiers I knew, he said quietly. Shadow's tail thumped once against the wooden porch. A pickup truck rumbled slowly up the dirt road. Ethan looked up. The truck stopped in the clearing, and an older woman stepped out. Ruth Callahan. She carried a metal container in her hands. Ethan walked down the porch steps to meet her. Morning, Ruth said, her voice warm but serious. Morning. She glanced at Shadow's bandaged leg. What happened to your dog? Someone left a spike trap in the yard last night. Ruth's face hardened. I figured something like that might happen. She handed Ethan the metal container. Venison stew. Thought you might not have much food up here yet. Ethan nodded. Thank you. Ruth looked past him toward the trees surrounding the cabin. Word travels fast in a town this small. Ethan frowned slightly. What word? That North Star's lawyers have been sniffing around your land again. She lowered her voice. And that you might be the first person in 20 years willing to push back. Ethan studied her face. You knew about what they've been doing here? Ruth sighed. My husband and I lost a spring on our property 10 years ago. The water turned brown.
North Star said it was natural minerals. She shook her head slowly. We knew better. Another truck appeared on the road, then another. Within minutes, 3 vehicles had gathered near the cabin. Ethan stepped back slightly as men and women from Red Pine climbed out. A rancher named Tom Grady, a mechanic from town, 2 brothers who ran the lumber yard. They approached the cabin with cautious determination. Tom tipped his hat. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning." Tom glanced at Shadow. "Heard about the trap." Ethan folded his arms. "People talk." "They do," Tom said. He gestured toward the trucks. "And a lot of folks around here have been waiting a long time for someone to stand up to North Star." The mechanic stepped forward. "They poisoned our creek 15 years ago." One of the lumberyard brothers spoke next. "They tried to buy our land cheap after that." Ruth crossed her arms. But most folks were too scared to fight them. Tom looked directly at Ethan. "You're not scared." Ethan thought about the bunker beneath the mountain, about the evidence hidden in those cabinets, about the letter from his grandfather.
No, Ethan said quietly. I'm not. Tom nodded. Good. He pointed toward the roof of the cabin. That roof's about ready to collapse. Another man added, and the fence line down the hill needs fixing. The mechanic cracked a grin. And if North Star sends more of their boys up here, it might help if a few locals are around. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. For months, maybe years, he had felt like a man fighting alone. But now, he wasn't. Shadow stood slowly beside him. The dog surveyed the gathering people carefully. Then he walked forward and sniffed Tom's hand. Tom chuckled. Good judge of character, that dog. Shadow's tail wagged once. Within an hour, the quiet clearing around the cabin turned into a work site. Ladders appeared. New boards were carried onto the roof. The fence along the dirt road was repaired. Someone started a small camp stove, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the morning air. Ethan stood near the porch, watching it all. Ruth walked up beside him. You see what happens when people realize they're not alone? Ethan nodded slowly. I guess I do. Shadow moved through the workers like a quiet guardian. Even with the injured leg, he walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the tree line every few minutes. Watching. Always watching. Late in the afternoon, a black SUV appeared again on the road far below. The same vehicle Ethan had seen the day before. Victor Lang stepped out beside it and looked toward the cabin. But this time, he wasn't looking at one man standing alone. He was looking at an entire group of mountain residents working together. Lang studied the scene through narrowed eyes. Then he quietly returned to the SUV and drove away. Tom noticed the vehicle disappearing down the road. Guess the lawyer didn't like what he saw. Ethan smiled faintly. No, he said. I don't think he did. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The repaired roof glowed golden in the fading light. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived in Wyoming, the cabin didn't feel like a forgotten place anymore. It felt like the beginning of something bigger. Night settled slowly over the Absaroka Mountains. The last trucks had left the clearing an hour earlier. The echo of engines faded down the dirt road until the valley returned to its natural silence. Ethan Walker sat on the front steps of the cabin. Shadow lay beside him, stretched across the wooden boards with his bandaged leg resting comfortably in the cool mountain air. Above them, the sky was deep and endless. Thousands of stars filled the Wyoming night. Ethan leaned back against one of the porch posts and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, his mind felt quiet. Not empty, just quiet. Shadow shifted slightly and rested his head across Ethan's boot. "You tired?" Ethan asked softly. The dog blinked once but didn't move. They had both been through a long few days, discovering the bunker, the evidence, the threats, and now something Ethan never expected. People, neighbors, a whole community that had quietly carried the same anger his grandfather once carried. Ethan looked across the clearing toward the tree line. The rocks hiding the bunker entrance sat in darkness beneath the tall pines. Beneath those rocks lay the truth his family had protected for decades. A legacy built by a man who refused to let powerful people bury the truth. Ethan picked up a small photograph from the step beside him. The one he had found inside the bunker. His grandfather, his father, and a younger version of himself. For years, Ethan had believed his father died in a meaningless accident. Now he knew the truth. His father had been trying to protect this valley, trying to protect people he barely knew. Shadow lifted his head and looked toward the distant mountains. The dog's ears twitched once. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze. Far away, a single truck moved slowly along the distant highway. Its headlights drifted through the darkness like a pair of small stars. Ethan knew North Star wasn't finished. Companies like that didn't walk away quietly. Victor Lang and the executives behind him would fight hard to protect their secrets. Courtrooms, lawyers, pressure, threats. The battle ahead might last years. But something inside Ethan had changed. He wasn't the same man who arrived at this cabin with nothing but a duffel bag and a loyal dog. The bunker had given him something else. A purpose. Shadow stood slowly and limped toward the edge of the porch. He scanned the quiet forest again before sitting down like a silent guard watching over the land. Ethan smiled faintly. "You know," he said quietly, "Grandpa was right about you." Shadow looked back at him. "You always see trouble before I do." The dog's tail moved once against the porch boards. Ethan leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Down in the valley below, lights from the small town of Red Pine glowed faintly in the distance. Those lights represented families, farmers, children drinking water from the same mountain streams North Star had poisoned. For years they had been fighting alone without knowing it. Now the truth existed again, hidden beneath the mountain, protected by a soldier, and a dog who never left his side. Ethan stood slowly. Shadow rose with him. The two of them walked to the edge of the clearing where the tall grass moved gently in the night wind. Ethan looked across the land his grandfather had left him. 50 acres of mountain rock and pine trees. Everyone had called it worthless. But they had been wrong. What Ethan had inherited wasn't just land. It wasn't just a bunker full of evidence. It wasn't even the money North Star had offered to buy his silence. What he inherited was courage. The same courage that made his father stand up to a powerful company. The same courage that made his grandfather build an entire underground vault to protect the truth. Ethan rested his hand on Shadow's neck, and for the first time since returning from war, he felt like he finally understood where he belonged. Right here, on this mountain, guarding a truth that was too important to bury. Shadow lifted his head toward the stars. The wind moved softly through the pines. And somewhere beneath the earth, the bunker waited patiently, holding the truth that would one day change everything. For the valley, for the people who lived there, and for the soldier who had finally found his way home. The war for the truth had only just begun. But Ethan Walker was ready to fight it. And this time, he wouldn't fight alone. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple comment below. You can type 1 if you believe loyalty like shadows still exists in the world. Or type 0 if you think people like Ethan deserve more respect when they come home from war. Even a single number helps this story reach more people who might need it. And tell me something else in the comments. Where are you watching from tonight? I read as many of your messages as I can. If you enjoy stories about courage, loyal dogs, and people who refuse to give up, make sure you subscribe to the channel. There are many more powerful stories waiting for you. Stories about veterans, about incredible dogs, and about ordinary people who discover extraordinary strength when life pushes them to the edge. So hit subscribe, stay with us, and I'll see you in the next story.